Welcome to Historians 1. What we are taught is history is often merely the official story, polished and presented by the victors. But beneath the marble floors of palaces and behind the velvet tapestries of power, darker truths lie buried. Truths of betrayal so profound they have silently steered the course of our world. Tonight, we pull back one such tapestry. This is not the history you know. This is the story of the betrayal that changed Europe forever. If you wish to hear more tales from the shadows, consider subscribing to Historians 1. Now, let us begin. It began not with a war or a treaty, but with a whisper in a torchlit corridor of the Palais de la Cité in Paris. The year was 1407. The air was thick with the scent of fear, incense, and wet wool. In a chamber overlooking the Seine, Louis, Duke of Orléans, brother to the mad King Charles VI of France, was reading a petition. He was a man of power, charm, and immense ambition, the de facto ruler of France during his brother's bouts of insanity. He believed himself secure, guarded by his status and his guards. He was wrong. The whisper had been a warning, passed from a lady-in-waiting to a page, from the page to a trusted valet. It spoke of a meeting, of a pact sworn not on a Bible, but on a dagger. The Duke dismissed it. The courts of Europe were forests of rumors. That night, as he left the palace to visit the Queen, his litter was set upon in the murky street of Rue Vieille du Temple. Men with faces obscured by hoods dragged him from the curtains, their weapons gleaming under a shrouded moon. The first blow from a poleaxe took his hand, the gift he raised in futile defense. The next strikes were merciless. The most powerful man in France lay dead in the gutter, his blood washing the cobbles. The murder sent seismic shockwaves through the kingdom. But this was not just a political assassination. It was the first public, violent crack in a facade. The perpetrator, it was soon discovered, was none other than his cousin and rival, John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. John brazenly admitted to the act, hiring a theologian to declare it a tyrannicide. The French court split into two monstrous factions, the Armagnacs, loyal to Orléans, and the Burgundians. This civil war would bleed France for decades, leaving it prostrate and vulnerable. Yet the true betrayal was not the act itself, but what it revealed and what it set in motion. The murder of the Duke of Orléans exposed a terrifying truth. The rules of chivalry and kinship that were supposed to bind the nobility were parchment thin. If a prince of the blood could be butchered in the street by his own cousin, what sacred trust remained unbreakable? It gave permission for every future atrocity in the name of power. It whispered to every ambitious noble, every slighted prince, the old bonds are dead. All that remains is opportunity. And in that chaos, a far more ancient and secretive power saw its chance to move from the shadows into the very heart of European destiny. This was not about Burgundy versus France. This was about something older, a secret guarded not in one family's castle, but within a brotherhood that spanned kingdoms. The assassination was merely the first move on a much larger, darker board. The stage was now set. France was crumbling from within, and across the Channel, a young, brilliant, and ruthlessly ambitious king watched the chaos unfold. His name was Henry IV. He saw a nation divided, its nobility at each other's throats. He saw the perfect opportunity to press an ancient claim to the French throne. The betrayal between Burgundy and the French crown would open the door for an invasion that would lead to one of the most famous battles in history. But what if Henry V knew more than he should have? What if his stunning success was not just a matter of military genius and longbows, but of inside knowledge, of secrets passed in the dead of night by those who had helped orchestrate France's collapse from within? The web was being woven, and at its center was a pact far more binding than any feudal oath. The dust of Agincourt had settled. On that muddy field in 1415, Henry V's outnumbered English army had shattered the French chivalry. It was a victory so complete, so divinely improbable, that it cemented Henry's legend. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 was its staggering prize. Henry was named heir and regent of France, married to the French Princess Catherine, and the mad King Charles VI disinherited his own son, the Dauphin. It was a masterstroke. England and France would be united under one crown. Historians speak of Henry's military prowess, of French disunity. But let us look closer at the disunity. The Burgundians, John the Fearless's faction, controlled Paris and the king. They were the ones who facilitated the Treaty of Troy. In 1419, just a year before the treaty, a fateful meeting occurred on the bridge at Montereau. John the Fearless met with the Dauphin to discuss reconciliation. It ended with John's assassination, his skull split open by an axe. The Dauphin's men were blamed, reigniting the civil war with fresh fury. But who truly benefited? Henry V. The Dauphin was now irredeemably tainted, and the new Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, burning for vengeance, threw his full support behind the English. The path to Troy was cleared. Was the bridge at Montereau merely a tragic diplomatic failure, or was it a deliberate provocation, orchestrated to ensure the Burgundian alliance with England remained ironclad? There were whispers that certain advisors around the Dauphin, men with ambiguous loyalties, had urged the violent stance. Whispers are the currency of hidden history. Now enter the secret thread. During this era, moving between the courts of Burgundy, France, and even England was a mysterious order. Not the Templars, they were destroyed a century before. This was subtler, a network of intellectuals, courtiers, and theologians who shared a common, heretical philosophy. They were sometimes called the New Athenians, or the Brotherhood of the Unseen Heart. Their belief? That the old orders, the church, the feudal monarchy, were corrupt and dying. They believed in a new world order governed by reason and secret knowledge, where power should reside with an enlightened few. They were not above using chaos as a tool for their grand design. Evidence is fragmentary, deliberately so, but in the private library of a Burgundian duke, nestled among treatises on courtly love, is a copied manuscript in cipher. When decoded in the 19th century, it spoke of the necessary pruning of the rotten branch, the House of Orléans, and the cultivation of the foreign graft, the Plantagenet claim. It was dated 1405, 2 years before Louis of Orléans' murder. The Brotherhood saw in Henry V not just a conqueror, but a potential philosopher king. He was intelligent, pious but reformist, and held the magnetic authority to reshape Christendom. Their agents, positioned in key roles, worked to soften French resistance, to magnify discord, and to guide Henry's political strategy. The betrayal of the French nobility by the Burgundians was, in their view, not a crime, but a surgical strike. The ultimate goal? A unified England and France under an enlightened ruler, a new Roman Empire guided by their hidden hand, ending the endless feudal wars that bled the continent. Henry V died young in 1422, his grand vision unfinished. The mad King Charles VI died weeks later. The stage was left to an infant Henry VI of England and France and the disinherited Dauphin Charles VII. The war, the infamous 100 Years' War, ground on. But the secret network did not vanish. They had planted their seed, and they would now shift their focus to the most unlikely of figures, the despairing, forgotten Dauphin, holed up in his shabby court at Bourges. They would send him a miracle and a weapon. The year is 1429. France is at its nadir. The English and their Burgundian allies control almost everything north of the Loire, including Paris. The Dauphin Charles is a figure of ridicule, indecisive and bankrupt, his claim to the throne a joke. Orléans, the key city barring the English from the south, is under siege. Its fall seems inevitable. Then, from the remote frontiers of Lorraine, comes a girl. She is Joan, the maid. She claims voices from God command her to raise the siege of Orléans and lead the Dauphin to his coronation at Reims. It is a story so fantastical it feels like divine intervention. And indeed, to the desperate French, it is. Joan breaks the siege of Orléans in a matter of days, wins a string of stunning victories, and sees Charles crowned King Charles VII at Reims Cathedral, in the very heart of enemy territory. She transforms the war from a dynastic squabble into a holy crusade for national salvation. But let us pause the legend. Let us ask the dangerous questions that historians have whispered for centuries. How did a peasant girl from Domremy secure an audience with the Dauphin within weeks of her departure? How did she pass the rigorous examination by theologians at Poitiers? How was she instantly given command of troops and outfitted in custom armor? This is not the normal path for a visionary shepherdess. There is a hidden corridor in this story. Before Joan arrived at Chinon, Charles was receiving counsel from a shadowy figure, his mother-in-law, Yolande of Aragon. Yolande was the power behind the throne, a political genius fighting for her son-in-law's survival. She maintained a vast network of spies, diplomats, and agents. Some scholars believe Yolande's network discovered Joan, or at least recognized her potential, and expertly shaped her narrative. They prepared the ground, guided her, and managed her introduction to the court. But was Yolande acting alone? Or was she connected to the deeper current, the brotherhood that had manipulated the earlier betrayal? Consider this. Joan's mission served to undermine the English and the Burgundian alliance, the very powers the brotherhood had initially supported through Henry Fifth. Why the shift? Because Henry VI was a weak child king, not the strong philosopher king they had hoped for. The experiment had failed. A resurgent France under a king indebted to a divine intervention could be a more malleable tool, especially if those who controlled the divine messenger also controlled the king. Joan's knowledge was curiously specific. She identified the Dauphin in a crowded room, though they say he was disguised. She knew of a secret prayer he had made. This smacks of prior intelligence, fed to a charismatic vessel. Her martial success? She was accompanied by seasoned, loyal captains like the Duke of Alençon and Etienne de Vignoles, La Hire. They were the true military minds. Joan was the unstoppable symbol, the living standard that rallied men to die. Then, the inevitable pivot. Joan is captured at Compiègne not by the English, but by the Burgundians. She is sold to the English. They put her on trial for heresy, a political trial run by a pro-English bishop, Pierre Cauchon. The trial is meticulously orchestrated to destroy her legitimacy and, by extension, that of Charles II. And here lies the second, even greater betrayal. Charles II, the king she made, does nothing to save her. He does not ransom her, though ransoming prisoners of rank was commonplace. He does not mount a military operation. He is silent. After a year of imprisonment and a rigged trial, Joan is burned at the stake in Rouen in 1431. Why? Because Joan had served her purpose. She had revived the Valois cause and crowned Charles. But now she was a liability. She was unpredictable, increasingly popular, and her continued presence kept the focus on war. Charles and his advisors, including the ruthless Archbishop Regnault de Chartres, were now pursuing secret peace negotiations with the Duke of Burgundy. Joan, the figurehead of holy war, was an obstacle to a pragmatic political deal. She had to be removed. Her death was a sacrifice on the altar of realpolitik, a cold betrayal by the very king she created. The Brotherhood's hand? Perhaps they simply faded back, their goal of a destabilized status quo achieved. France was saved, but its savior was betrayed, and the king carried a stain of guilt that would forever make him vulnerable to secret influence. The unity they dreamed of was shattered, but in the fracture lay opportunities for the cunning. The stage was now set for a different kind of game, one played not on battlefields, but in bedchambers and royal nurseries, where bloodlines themselves could be forged and falsified. The smoke from Joan's pyre had scarcely dispersed before Charles VII, now called the Victorious, began the methodical reconquest of France. By 1453, the 100 Years' War was over, the English expelled save for Calais. Charles ruled a united kingdom, but the betrayal that founded his reign haunted him. He became paranoid, reclusive, convinced of plots, and he was right to be. His court was a snake pit, and the deadliest serpent was his own son, the Dauphin Louis. Louis despised his father. Their relationship was so toxic that Louis fled to the court of the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, the old enemy, where he lived for 5 years, a puppet prince in waiting, fermenting rebellion. In 1461, Charles VII died, of illness it was said, though rumors swirled of poison administered by his son's agents. Louis V was crowned. He was called the Spider King, and for good reason. He spun webs of conspiracy that entangled all of Europe. His entire reign was a masterpiece of betrayal and counter-betrayal, a cynical dance where today's ally was tomorrow's prisoner in an iron cage. He crushed the remaining great nobles, not with armies, but with bribes, lies, and judicial murder. He centralized power in the monarchy like never before. But here, the hidden thread resurfaces in a new, sinister form. Louis XI was famously superstitious and surrounded himself with astrologers, doctors, and low-born advisors. Among his most trusted was a shadowy financier named Jacques Coeur, who built a commercial empire that bankrolled the king. Coeur was arrested on trumped-up charges of poisoning the king's mistress and died in exile. His true crime? knowing too much about the royal finances and the king's secret dealings. Louis's network of spies was legendary, the first true secret service in Europe. But was it entirely his own invention? Or was he, perhaps unwittingly, using a pre-existing structure? The methods of the Brotherhood, cipher, intelligence gathering, the use of manipulation over force, were now the tools of statecraft. The Spider King may have believed he was the master of the web, but what if the web itself belonged to an older, patient architect? The most telling clue lies in Louis's greatest obsession, eliminating the Duchy of Burgundy. The duchy, under the dazzling, ambitious Charles the Bold, was now a powerhouse rivaling France itself. Louis the Theft financed and conspired with Burgundy's enemies, most notably the Swiss Confederacy. In 1477, at the Battle of Nancy, Charles the Bold was killed, his body found half-eaten by wolves. The Duchy of Burgundy was dismantled, its lands partitioned. This was the final, bloody payoff of the original betrayal. The murder of Louis of Orléans in 1407 had unleashed the Burgundian monster that devoured France. Now, 70 years later, a French king had finally slain it, using the very tools of treachery and realpolitik that the Burgundians had pioneered. The cycle of betrayal begun on a Parisian street was complete. France emerged as the dominant, centralized kingdom of Europe. But secrets, like royal blood, have a way of seeping through generations. Louis XI's daughter, Anne of France, was one of the most capable rulers of the age, acting as regent. She wrote a manual of statecraft for her daughter. Its central theme, trust no one. Be prepared to dissemble, to betray before you are betrayed. It was the codified doctrine of the world the original conspiracy had helped create, a world where loyalty was a currency, not a virtue. The stage of Europe was now set for a new drama, the rise of the great nation-states. And as France, Spain, and England solidified, the game of hidden influence scaled up. The next act would not be in the streets of Paris or the fields of Burgundy, but in the most sacred chambers of all, the Vatican itself. For where better to steer the soul of a continent than from the throne of St. Peter? The Renaissance dawned, and with it the papacy became less a spiritual office and more a spectacular, corruptible prize. In 1492, as Columbus sailed for a new world, an old world was being bought in Rome. Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia, through brazen bribery and simony, secured the papal tiara, becoming Pope Alexander VI. His reign would become synonymous with nepotism, debauchery, and poison. It was the logical, grotesque culmination of a century where sacred oaths meant nothing. Alexander VI had children, most famously Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia. He used them as pawns in a game to carve out a Borgia kingdom in central Italy. Murder by Cantarella, a secret Borgia poison, strategic marriages, and blackmail were their tools. But the Borgias were not alone in their villainy. They were merely the most flamboyant players in a system where every cardinal was a prince, every bishop a politician. Where was our hidden current in this morass? It had evolved. The Brotherhood of the Unseen Heart, if it persisted, would now be found not just among nobles, but among the humanist scholars, the bankers, and the artists of the era. Their belief in a new order now dovetailed with the rediscovery of classical knowledge. But the corruption of the Church was an obstacle to their vision of an enlightened age. Consider the fate of one man. Girolamo Savonarola, the fanatical Dominican friar who briefly held Florence in his grip, preaching against the corruption of the Church and the Borgias. He held bonfires of the vanities and declared a new Puritan republic. Alexander VI excommunicated him. Savonarola was eventually captured, tortured, and in 1498 burned at the stake, a eerie echo of Joan of Arc. Who moved against Savonarola? The papal forces, certainly, but also the wealthy Florentines whose luxuries he burned, and the political rivals he alienated. Yet whispers from Florentine diaries suggest that agents provocateurs, men with connections to Rome and to banking houses beyond the Alps, helped orchestrate his downfall. Savonarola's vision of a purged, theocratic state was as much a threat to the secret architects of a secular new order as it was to the Borgias. His removal was a convergence of interests, a silent, bloody pact between the openly corrupt and the secretly ambitious. The Borgia papacy showed Europe that no institution was sacred, that even the vicar of Christ could be a master of betrayal. This profound cynicism directly fueled the coming Reformation. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the Wittenberg door in 1517, he was channeling a rage that had been simmering for a century, a rage born from watching kings betray their kin and popes betray their God. The secret network, if it watched, likely approved. The shattering of Christendom's unity was, to their philosophy, another necessary pruning. From the chaos of religious war, they believed a new, more rational world might eventually grow. But the most potent legacy of this era of betrayal was not religious, but genetic. The intermarriages of the nobility, the bastard lines, the disputed successions, all this intrigue had created a volatile cocktail of claims and counterclaims across the continent. The bloodlines of England, Spain, France, and the Holy Roman Empire were now a tangled, disputed web. And in that web, the next world-shattering conflict was being spun. It would erupt in the heart of the new powerful Spain, and it would center on a king who was perhaps not who he claimed to be. Our story now turns to the most powerful man in Christendom in the early 16th century. Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Spain, Archduke of Austria, Lord of the Netherlands. His empire was one on which the sun never set. He was the culmination of generations of strategic Habsburg marriages, a living monument to the power of bloodlines. But let us focus on his origins. He was the son of Juana of Castile, Joanna the Mad, and Philip the Handsome of Burgundy. Philip was the son of Mary of Burgundy and Maximilian, the heiress of that very Burgundian duchy whose story is so central to our tale. When Philip died young, and Juana was deemed insane, their son Charles inherited Spain, the Habsburg lands, and the Burgundian legacy. Here, a dark and persistent rumor, whispered in the courts of his enemies and even in some chronicles, raises its head. The rumor claimed that the infant who would become Charles V was swapped at birth, that the true son of Juana and Philip died, and a substitute, a child of more obscure, perhaps even common birth, was put in his place to secure the dynastic union. It is a story often dismissed as anti-Habsburg propaganda, but let us examine the context. Juana was deeply unstable, fiercely possessive of her husband Philip even after his death, dragging his coffin with her for years. Philip was a notorious womanizer. The court was a hotbed of Burgundian and Spanish factions vying for control of the heirs. In such an environment, could a switch be possible? For whom would it be beneficial? For the Burgundian advisors, to ensure their influence continued through a pliable ruler. For a secret network that wanted a specific individual, groomed from infancy, to hold ultimate power? Charles V's reign was defined by a titanic struggle, holding his fractured empire together against the Ottoman Turks, the French Valois kings, and the rising tide of Protestantism. He was a man of immense duty, but also of profound melancholy. He famously abdicated in 1556, retiring to a monastery, broken by the weight of his titles. Was it just the burden of rule? Or was there a deeper, secret burden? The knowledge of an illicit identity, the ultimate betrayal of his own blood. The true impact of this rumor, real or not, lies in its symbolic power. It suggests that by the 16th century, the concept of divine right monarchy, of sacred blood, was so fragile that even the mightiest emperor's legitimacy could be a fabrication. The betrayals of the past had so polluted the well of trust that no lineage was above suspicion. This crisis of legitimacy exploded in the next generation. Charles V split his empire. The Spanish crown went to his son, Philip II, and the Holy Roman Empire to his brother, Ferdinand. Philip II, fanatically Catholic, would launch the Spanish Armada against Protestant England and wage brutal wars in the Netherlands. His reign was the bedrock of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. But in France, a direct line of consequence was playing out. The descendants of the Spider King, Louis VI, were now the Valois line. They were embroiled in deadly rivalry with the Habsburgs. And within France, the religious wars between Catholics and Protestants, Huguenots, turned the kingdom into a slaughterhouse. The apex of this horror was the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, when thousands of Huguenots were murdered in Paris on the orders of the royal court. The betrayal here was of guest right, of peace treaties, of basic humanity. It was sanctioned at the highest level by Catherine de' Medici, the Queen Mother. The message was clear. No oath, no treaty, no promise was sacred if it stood in the way of dynastic and religious power. The poison of 1407 had now infected the very soul of a nation. From the assassination of a duke, to the burning of a maid, to the massacres in the streets, a pattern emerged, the unraveling of all binding moral and social codes in the pursuit of power. Europe was now a continent where sovereignty was absolute, suspicion was paramount, and the state's interest justified any treachery. This was the new, bleak reality forged in the secret fires of the past. It is 1610, Paris. Henry IV of France, one of the nation's greatest kings, a former Protestant who converted to Catholicism to secure his throne. Paris is worth a mass, has brought peace and prosperity after the religious wars. He is popular, but he has made enemies. The Catholic extremists who never trusted the former Huguenot, the Habsburgs whose power he challenged, and the great nobles whose privileges he curtailed. On May 14th, his carriage is stalled in a narrow street. A man named François Ravaillac steps onto a wheel, reaches into the window, and stabs the king 3 times. Henry IV dies instantly. Ravaillac is a fanatic, acting alone, he claims under torture. He's executed with horrific brutality. The official story is simple: regicide by a lone madman. But the shadows tell another tale. Henry IV was planning a grand war against the Habsburgs, a conflict that would have redrawn the map of Europe. His assassination conveniently prevented that war. Who benefited? Spain and the Habsburgs, certainly. The ultra-Catholic faction in France who feared Henry's policies, possibly. But there is a deeper, more haunting connection. Henry IV was the first Bourbon king of France. He was descended from Louis VI, St. Louis. But his more recent ancestor was Charles, Duke of Bourbon, the Constable of France who, in the early 1500s, betrayed King Francis I and fought for the Habsburg Emperor Charles V. Betrayal was in his lineage. More strikingly, Henry IV's wife, Marie de Medici, was rumored to have had prior knowledge of the plot. She was ambitious, sidelined by her husband, and close to pro-Spanish advisors. The court became a nest of accusations. While no proof against her was ever found, the stench of conspiracy never faded. This event, the assassination of a unifying king by a seemingly simple fanatic, is the final, chilling legacy of our story. It proves that the culture of betrayal, born from the noble intrigues of the 15th century, had now democratized. It was no longer just a tool for dukes and kings. The idea that supreme power could be changed by a single, treacherous act had trickled down into the psyche of Europe. If a Duke of Orléans could be killed for political gain, why not a king? The precedent was set centuries before. From the murder of Louis of Orléans in 1407 to the assassination of Henry IV in 1610, the thread is unbroken. Each act of high treachery made the next one more thinkable, more acceptable. The secret networks may have shifted, their members changed, but the philosophy endured. The end justifies the means, and no bond is sacred if it impedes the grand design, whether that design is for a unified Europe, a reformed church, or simply raw power. The Europe that emerged from this 2-century crucible of betrayal was the Europe of the modern age, a continent of sovereign nation-states locked in perpetual balance of power politics, where espionage was as important as diplomacy, and where the interests of the state trumped all feudal or personal loyalty. The age of chivalry was dead, murdered on a Paris street. The age of realpolitik was born. This is the hidden story. The betrayal that changed Europe forever was not one event, but a chain. A chain that began with a dagger in the dark and ended by convincing men that the highest authority in the land could be removed with a knife. It reshaped borders, shattered faith, and forged a world where power, not principle, is the ultimate currency. The echoes of those 15th century whispers in the Palais de la Cité still resonate in the corridors of power today. If you've been chilled by these shadows from the past, remember, history is a palimpsest. What is written on the surface often hides a deeper, darker text. For more explorations into the secrets beneath the stone, subscribe to Historians 1. Until next time.